As the stillness of night settled over the sprawling forbidden city, candle flames flickered against the red lacquered pillars, casting tremulous shadows on the intricate carvings of dragon motifs. Within the silence of the palace walls, a young woman, no more than a shadow wrapped tightly in a thick blanket, moved slowly on her knees along the polished stone floor. Her breath was shallow, her eyes vacant, as she crawled steadily toward the dragon-embroidered bedding where the son of heaven awaited. Outside, the soft patter of eunuch slippers tapped in rhythm with ritual, not emotion. In this hidden world of the Qing dynasty's inner court, human desire was irrelevant. What mattered was protocol. What ruled was hierarchy. And what destroyed lives was the illusion of favor. In the imperial harem, home to over 3,000 women, every evening resembled a dangerous ceremony in which one could rise with a glance or fall with a whisper. These women were neither wives nor lovers in the traditional sense, but pawns carefully positioned in an elaborate system of control. Each night was a calculated move, and each imperial visit was never spontaneous affection but rather a state-managed act shrouded in decorum, dread, and silence. Despite the beauty of golden screens and silk canopies, the harem functioned more like a gilded prison, where autonomy was stripped, voices muted, and bodies offered without consent. The emperor did not pick partners through romance or familiarity, but by drawing one among many wooden plaques, each carved with the name of a concubine. The selected name, no matter whose it was, triggered an unyielding ritual. The woman would be informed, expected to cleanse herself thoroughly, apply prescribed perfumes, and present herself in utter physical perfection. Yet, after such preparation, she was forbidden to dress. She was to be wrapped tightly in a quilt, her hands folded, her body entirely still, as she waited for the eunuchs to transport her to the emperor's quarters like an object of tribute. Walking was not allowed, she had to be carried or later crawl, never to appear presumptuous in posture. Once inside the chamber, still cloaked in silence, she was expected to approach the imperial bed from the foot, her motion slow and deliberate, every movement a symbol of humility and obedience. There was no room for voice, laughter, or sound. During the entire interaction, concubines were forbidden from speaking, moaning, or expressing emotion. The sleeping chamber was a sacred battlefield where sound itself was subversive. No personal accessories were allowed, no rings, no pendants, not even silk hairpins, under the pretext of safety, but more likely to erase individuality and maintain complete imperial dominance. During the act, no candles flickered by choice. They were positioned precisely for oversight. 12 eunuchs were posted discreetly nearby, not out of trust, but as wardens of time and regulation. Once the designated hour approached, a eunuch outside would begin to call, first calmly, then louder, until the emperor acknowledged. This served as both an alarm and a reminder: desire had an expiration. No matter the intimacy or lack thereof, the moment had to end. Following this, the woman would wrap herself again, bow, crawl backward, and be returned to her residence. But what followed after the return was often more disturbing than the ceremony itself. In that room where no love was allowed, the question that hung in the air like incense smoke was never, was it pleasurable, but rather, should the imperial essence be retained? It was not the concubine's question to ask, nor her body's choice to keep. A eunuch would ask the emperor directly, did he wish for the seed to remain, allowing a pregnancy to take root? If he declined, a disturbing routine followed. Eunuchs would manipulate the concubine's body, pressing harshly on known acupressure points on her abdomen, rubbing in deliberate motion to force the release of every remaining drop of imperial fluid. The process, while masked as a preventative measure, opened the door to exploitation. Many eunuchs saw this moment as an opportunity to assert control, to grope, to violate boundaries, and to humiliate, knowing well that the woman beneath them could not protest without risking her future. A single complaint could mean never being summoned again. And in the palace, to lose imperial favor was to fade into irrelevance, confined to a corner of the court, growing old and forgotten without status or voice. Thus, many women suffered this in silence, some bargaining with eunuchs in the hope of gaining sympathy, some quietly crying when no one watched, and others resigning to the ritual as just another step in surviving one more night. And yet, not all concubines viewed these encounters as sacred or aspirational. For many, being summoned felt closer to punishment than reward, particularly when their bodies betrayed them during menstruation, a natural biological cycle that feudal beliefs considered impure and inauspicious. The emperor, seen as a divine being, was not to be defiled by blood. If a concubine was discovered to be menstruating during an encounter, it could be interpreted as a grave offense. In best-case scenarios, she would lose favor permanently. In worse cases, she might be accused of disrespecting the imperial countenance and face execution. To avoid such outcomes, many women resorted to desperate measures. Some attempted the most daring deception of all, substitution. In a harem with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women, many looked similar, especially those chosen young. If a concubine had not been summoned in months, it was likely the emperor wouldn't remember her face. Some would bribe a palace maid of similar appearance to take their place, provided the overseeing eunuchs turned a blind eye. This was incredibly risky. Discovery would mean death, for both the impostor and the real concubine. The punishment for deceiving the Son of Heaven was severe, absolute, and public. Because of that, such gambles were rare and carried out only by the most desperate or bold. Others relied on signals, developed quietly across dynasties. In the Han period, a concubine might wear a ring whose name sounded like a coded reference to her condition. In the Tang dynasty, a red dot painted subtly on the cheek served as a sign to female attendants. Some regions practiced marking with red threads, others hung red lanterns outside their quarters. In every case, the color red, a warning of nature, spoke for those forbidden to speak. These signals helped women avoid selection discreetly, preserving both modesty and their lives. By the time of the Qing dynasty, the process was formalized. A special bureau, the Jing Yufan, maintained and presented the name tags. Women who were menstruating could quietly inform the eunuchs, and their tokens would be removed from the rotation. It was an organized effort, not necessarily for their benefit, but to maintain the perfection of the nightly imperial display. Still, such systems only worked if the emperor was not insistent. If he chose a woman, her refusal would be near impossible, regardless of health or circumstance. To decline was to insult. Therefore, mastering these subtle signs was not vanity, it was survival. But there were moments when the walls of routine thinned, if only slightly, offering the women inside a glimpse of something less suffocating. When the emperor departed the Forbidden City for retreats in the Summer Palace or the cool relief of Qingde Mountain, the rigidity of court life softened. During these excursions, the carefully choreographed rituals of nightly selection faded into the background. There were no name tags, no regulated summons, no suffocating crawl toward ceremonial intimacy. In these rare interludes, spontaneity was allowed to breathe, and for some concubines, this was the only time the emperor's gaze might settle upon them without layers of formality shielding every glance. These moments, brief, unpredictable, fleeting, felt like starlight breaking through storm clouds. But they were as rare as they were fragile. The imperial system did not like to loosen its grip for long. When the emperor returned to the Forbidden City, the machinery of control resumed at full force. Every word spoken, every look exchanged, every movement made by the women in the harem became loaded with risk. Beauty, while praised, was never enough. Intelligence, while helpful, was not safe. The only guaranteed path to influence was through pregnancy, and even that route was perilous. If a woman conceived with the emperor's permission, and the act had been properly logged, then she would be elevated, sometimes instantly. Her name would be recorded meticulously, the time, the date, the precise circumstances of conception, the identity of the eunuchs involved in the visit. All of it would be entered into imperial ledgers with the care of someone documenting the birth of a new era. If the resulting child was a male heir, and the emperor acknowledged him, then his mother's life could transform overnight. She might rise from a faceless consort to an honored lady, a ranked concubine, even a noble consort of imperial standing. But the window to such fortune was narrow and full of hazards. If conception occurred without official approval, or worse, against the emperor's express wish, the consequences were brutal. The process to prevent such pregnancies began almost immediately after the emperor's decision. If he chose not to preserve his seed, eunuchs were tasked with ensuring that not a trace remained inside the woman's body. They pressed and massaged the lower abdomen, not gently, but with intention and power, sometimes bruising the skin, sometimes crossing boundaries, always under the guise of duty. For the concubine lying motionless beneath their hands, there was no option but to submit, regardless of discomfort or degradation. But not all submitted passively. Some women, desperate for a child, for a sliver of power in a place where they had none, tried to preserve what they could. They would shift their bodies subtly to prevent full extraction, delay the eunuchs by feigning weakness or sudden nausea, switch towels laced with fluid, or conceal linens touched by imperial essence. These tactics were never without risk. If discovered, the concubine could be charged with deception against the imperial bloodline, an offense seen as no different from treason. Punishments ranged from public beatings to silent execution, or worse, lifetime confinement in the cold palace, a place as forgotten as its name implied. Others tried different paths. They forged relationships with eunuchs, offering gifts, promises, even discreet physical favors. These were not acts of affection, but transactions. A concubine might offer jewelry or family connections in exchange for a favorable name tag placement, a warning about her upcoming rotation, or subtle assistance in hiding a pregnancy. Some eunuchs, aware of the leverage they held, played both sides, feeding information, collecting bribes, controlling which women were seen and which were erased. The relationship between eunuchs and concubines was never simple. It was part alliance, part blackmail, part silent war. It was a survival game in which both parties walked a fine line. If a concubine wanted to be called upon again, she had to make sure her name stayed near the top of the pile. If she wanted her child officially recognized, she needed witnesses. If she wanted protection from jealousy, she needed someone who could whisper into the right ears. And so the currency of the palace was not only beauty or blood, but silence, favors, and debt. The longer a woman survived within the harem, the more adept she became at playing this dangerous game. She learned when to speak, when to cry, when to smile, and when to pretend. She memorized the emperor's moods, the eunuch's routines, and the language of gifts. She became a master of passive resistance, knowing that even her breath could be monitored for treachery. Still, pregnancy remained the most direct, and most volatile, path to influence. For that reason, many concubines risked everything to preserve the possibility. Some even defied orders, refusing the massage meant to expel the imperial seed, or attempting to sneak off before the eunuchs arrived. Others allowed themselves to be touched by eunuchs in return for assistance, helping with record falsification, tampering with schedules, or gaining temporary protection. Such acts were not born of want, but of calculation. When you have no choices, every action becomes strategic. Behind the curtains of the imperial bedchambers, where silence reigned louder than any scream, these women fought to maintain dignity in the smallest ways. They endured unwanted touches, suffocating rituals, and soul-crushing loneliness, all for the hope that one night might end differently, that one child might change everything. Yet even pregnancy, the supposed key to freedom, could backfire. If a woman conceived during a forbidden time, say, during menstruation, or when the emperor had not ordered it kept, the options were grim. Abortion was one route, often performed in secret and without compassion. Another was to carry the child in silence, giving birth quietly, hoping that by the time it was discovered, it would be too late to undo. But rarely did such gambles pay off. The imperial court was unkind to error. Even infants were not spared. Every pregnancy was recorded down to the minute, not just to confirm legitimacy, but to serve as legal evidence in future succession disputes. An unrecorded conception meant the child could never inherit, and the mother might disappear before she could even name her baby. These realities placed enormous pressure on women carrying imperial heirs. During pregnancy, a concubine was monitored day and night. Her diet controlled, her movement limited, her servants replaced with trusted watchers. A yawn could be misread as disrespect, a stumble interpreted as a threat to the unborn bloodline. Even sneezing too loudly might trigger suspicion. They lived in a constant state of surveillance, where the price of motherhood was total surrender. Yet despite all the risk, some women clung to their plans. They manipulated the record keepers, they bribed the midwives, they lied to the eunuchs. For them, one successful birth could mean a palace, a title, and security for their family outside the walls. But they knew the stakes. If exposed, they would be flogged, cast out, or worse, their child taken and declared illegitimate. In the most tragic cases, both mother and child disappeared, erased from the books, erased from memory. The deeper one digs into the structure of the imperial harem, the more it becomes clear, it was never a place of beauty or romance. It was a web of quiet warfare, with each woman waging her own battle for relevance, survival, and agency. The polished lacquer walls, the soft rustle of silk, the delicate scent of incense, these were masks for a machine built on obedience, pain, and fear. It is easy, centuries later, to be seduced by the aesthetics of the Qing palace, the elegant robes, the poetic gardens, the gleam of golden thrones. But behind all of it were women who had no freedom, no rights, and sometimes not even their names. They were forced to crawl toward power, only to be cast aside the moment they stepped out of line. Their bodies were scrutinized, used, and discarded, their minds underestimated but always quietly plotting. And their emotions, their longing for love, for choice, for safety, were crushed beneath a system that valued silence above all. In this world, favor was not affection, it was a leash. To be chosen was not a victory, it was a risk. To be remembered was rare. And to survive, one had to become fluent in secrecy, deception, and sacrifice. And for those who managed to carry a pregnancy to term with official approval, the scrutiny did not end, it only intensified. Every stage of the gestation was catalogued by palace officials. The woman's food was tasted by others before she could eat, her chambers were constantly checked for signs of sabotage, and she was never left unattended. If a rival suspected the pregnancy could jeopardize her own standing, poisoning and interference were real possibilities. The unborn child was no longer just a baby, it was a political entity, a symbol of influence, and potentially a future ruler. For this reason, even while carrying life inside her, the concubine was not afforded rest or joy. She lived in fear, watched by eyes that pretended to serve but secretly judged. She could not speak freely, could not sleep deeply, could not smile too often. Everything was noted. Should she miscarry, it might be seen as weakness, or worse, as sabotage by her enemies. The emperor might turn cold, suspicious of her body's failure, and even the sympathy of others would be colored by caution. In contrast, a successful delivery of a son could propel her from obscurity to historical relevance. Yet that too was not guaranteed. Not all imperial sons lived long. Not all were recognized. And many disappeared in infancy due to illness or quiet politics. If the newborn failed to survive, the mother's status reverted, sometimes lower than before. She might be blamed for weakness of blood, for poor behavior during pregnancy, or even for past mistakes that the court now chose to remember. The concubines were never truly safe, even in triumph. Their lives balanced precariously between brief moments of imperial attention and the long silences that followed. Each choice they made, each bribe, each alliance, each calculated risk, was done to survive a world that required them to be invisible yet flawless, obedient yet strategic, silent yet alert. The harem, for all its shimmering robes and perfumed halls, was a prison disguised as paradise. Every concubine entered the forbidden city with the faint hope of rising, of capturing the emperor's heart, of perhaps becoming a consort or even empress. But most never reached beyond the title of chosen woman, and many died without ever being called once. Some went mad. Some took their own lives. Others became ghosts who wandered the garden paths and inner courtyards long after their names had vanished from the scrolls. And while their stories rarely survived the pages of official history, Their lives shaped the atmosphere of fear and submission that hung over the palace like mist. The eunuchs, too, were both jailers and prisoners, men stripped of manhood, turned into instruments of imperial order. They enforced the rules with devotion and cruelty, yet many of them held their own secret resentments, choosing to exert what little power they had over the women who could not strike back. These dynamics created a dark intimacy between concubines and eunuchs, a codependence filled with resentment, manipulation, occasional sympathy, and constant risk. The women knew that every encounter with a eunuch might involve pain or exploitation, but it might also be the only way to gain an advantage in a place where opportunities were as rare as truth. And above them all sat the emperor, the only man who could change a woman's fate with a look, a word, or a whim. But he, too, was often distant, disconnected from the weight his choices carried. To him, the women may have blurred together, their names reduced to carvings on tokens, their faces interchangeable. His attention was fragmented between governance, politics, superstition, and his own amusement. A decision made in a single instant, such as whether to keep the seed, determined whether a woman would rise or fall, live or be lost. For him, it was routine. For her, it was everything. The coldest truth of all is that many concubines did not even seek love. They were too smart for that. Love required vulnerability. Vulnerability invited destruction. Instead, they sought visibility. They fought to be seen, to be remembered, to be acknowledged even once in a world that made them faceless. Their weapons were subtle, a glance held a second too long, a carefully chosen scent that reminded the emperor of a distant memory, a posture designed to convey innocence or allure. They could not speak with their voices, so they spoke with their bodies, their silence, their stillness. And all of it, every effort, every maneuver, depended on a single wooden tag being selected from a tray. That tag, small and silent, held the power to dictate a woman's life. With it came the possibility of attention, and with attention came the potential for elevation, motherhood, protection. But without it, she faded, year after year, waiting behind painted screens, listening for footsteps that never approached. Eventually, she was moved to the lower quarters. Then, forgotten entirely. The imperial harem was never a place for the faint-hearted. It required patience sharper than knives, endurance thicker than palace walls, and strategy as intricate as calligraphy on imperial decrees. It was a place where women survived by erasing themselves, then reappearing only when the moment was right. They endured pain disguised as duty, abuse dressed in silk, and humiliation carried out with ceremony. They were called concubines, but in truth, they were prisoners, actresses, warriors, and sacrifices. Each night in the harem was not a fairy tale, but a performance. Each pregnancy was not a blessing, but a gamble. Each breath had to be measured. Each misstep was punished. To survive, one had to accept the rules, then learn to bend them without being noticed. The system was merciless, but within it, these women carved paths of resistance through whispers, gestures, and calculation. And although their names may not remain, the echoes of their footsteps, their fears, and their sacrifices still linger in the cold chambers of the Forbidden City. They were not weak. They were survivors of a world designed to silence them. And in that silence, they learned to speak more powerfully than anyone ever expected.